The first thing I saw through the peephole were the badges. They looked almost real, gleaming under my porch light with an authority that felt immediately wrong. Two uniformed figures stood rigid on my welcome mat, their postures stiff, their eyes fixed on my door with an intensity that made the hair on my neck stand up. Pause the video and tell me, where are you watching from? I want to see how far HOA stories are heard. One held a clipboard, the other rested a hand on what looked like a duty belt, complete with handcuffs and a radio. My own FBI training kicked in before my morning coffee had even brewed. The proportions were off, the insignia unfamiliar, the entire presentation a carefully constructed facade. But the pounding on my door was very real. This was the moment. My quiet retirement assignment in Portland, Oregon collided with something far more sinister than overgrown grass or the wrong shade of beige. They thought they were the law on this picture-perfect street. They were about to learn they had just knocked on the wrong door. The Laurel Ridge subdivision was a masterclass in suburban illusion. Every lawn was a perfect emerald green carpet, each blade of grass seemingly cut to the exact same height. The houses, a series of variations on a beige and gray theme, stood in silent, uniform approval. The only sound after 8 p.m. was the whisper of automated sprinklers and the distant hum of a highway. It was quiet, orderly, and to someone who had spent 2 decades navigating the chaotic, morally gray landscapes of international counterintelligence, it was the perfect place to disappear. My name is Ethan Cole, and after a career that left me with a slight limp and a profound distrust of quiet rooms, I had taken a remote liaison role with the Bureau. This house, with its generic floor plan and neutral walls, was my sanctuary. My only neighbors were a retired couple who collected garden gnomes and a young family whose greatest rebellion was a slightly off-schedule trash can placement. And then there was the HOA. The Laurel Ridge Homeowners Association was run by a woman named Eleanor Vance. She wasn't just the president, she was its architect, its high priestess, its unquestioned sovereign. I'd seen her type before. Not in terrorist cells or foreign intelligence agencies, but in the petty bureaucracies that can wield rule books like blunt instruments. She presided over the monthly meetings from a raised podium at the community clubhouse, her silver blonde hair never out of place, her smile never quite reaching her cold, assessing eyes. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC&Rs, were her Bible. She could quote article, section, and subsection on the proper curvature of a driveway apron or the approved molecular composition of a roof shingle. To most residents, she was a nuisance. To me, she was a fascinating study in localized power dynamics. I kept my head down. My work required focus, and the last thing I needed was a feud over my laurel hedge being 6 inches too tall. I paid my dues on time, kept my garbage cans concealed, and made sure my outdoor lighting conformed to the approved soft white spectrum. I was a ghost in the machine, a model citizen by all outward appearances. But the quiet was a veneer. I began to notice things, small fractures in the perfect facade. A van would arrive at odd hours at Eleanor's house, not delivering packages, but loading small, crated items. The retired couple, the Harrises, suddenly stopped waving, their faces drawn and anxious when they saw me. I found a single, hastily printed flyer tucked under my wiper one morning, the words, "Save Yourself," typed above a blurred image of the HOA logo before it was snatched away by the wind. The neighborhood wasn't just peaceful, it was compliant. It was a silence born not of contentment, but of vigilance. I had chosen this place for its anonymity, but I was starting to realize that in a gilded cage, the quietest bird is often the most closely watched. The stage was set, not for a simple disagreement over property lines, but for a collision between my world of concrete evidence and theirs of manufactured authority. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. It wasn't in the mailbox with the bills and catalogs. It was slipped between my front door and its frame, a single heavy-stock piece of paper folded crisply in thirds. The paper itself felt expensive, watermark embossed with the HOA's seal. The heading, in severe, bolded font, read, "Official Notice of Non-Compliance and Hearing." My eyes scanned the document, my analyst's mind parsing the language faster than most would read a grocery list. The alleged violations were absurd. Citation 14B, unauthorized installation of subterranean structural modifications. I'd had a new water heater installed. Citation 9D, non-standard electromagnetic frequency emissions detected from dwelling. My personal internet router. Citation 22A, the most egregious. Creation of a clandestine ingress-egress point posing a security risk to the community. They were referring to a dog door I'd installed for a Labrador I didn't even own. It was for my sister's dog when she visited. Each violation carried an escalating fine structure, culminating in a threat of lien placement on my property. But it was the final paragraph that made my blood run cold. It stated that due to the severely clandestine nature of the violations, my case had been escalated to the HOA Security and Compliance Division for immediate investigation. I was ordered to make myself available for a mandatory property inspection. The notice was signed not just by Eleanor Vance, but by a chief of compliance whose name I didn't recognize. The language was deliberately intimidating, crafted to sound official and legal, but to a trained eye it was pure theater. Subterranean structural modifications, clandestine ingress points. This was the language of paranoia, of someone projecting their own secrets onto others. This wasn't about a dog door. This was a pretext. A cold certainty settled in my gut. Eleanor Vance, or whoever was pulling her strings, wasn't interested in my compliance. They were interested in my house. They wanted inside. The notice wasn't a fine. It was a warrant. A fake one, issued by a fake government, but a warrant nonetheless. The carefully maintained peace of Laurel Ridge had just been shattered by a piece of paper, and the first move in a very dangerous game had just been made. The days after the notice arrived were marked by a subtle, chilling shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was observant. I began to notice a black sedan with tinted windows, always parked 2 blocks down, its engine off, but a faint plume of exhaust sometimes visible in the early morning chill. It was never there when I looked directly, but always in my peripheral vision, a shark circling just beyond the reef. My morning runs became exercises in counter-surveillance. I noted license plates of unfamiliar vehicles, the faces of joggers who seemed more interested in my pace than their own, the way the curtain in Eleanor Vance's upstairs window twitched closed as I passed. The Harrises actively crossed the street to avoid me, their faces pale masks of fear. The rules themselves took on a more sinister, arbitrary tone. New notices appeared on the community board, laminated and official. Ordinance 78, C. All window coverings must remain open between the hours of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. to ensure visual harmony and community transparency. Another, Ordinance 91F, mandated that all residential power consumption levels must be submitted weekly for energy audit compliance. They were no longer governing aesthetics. They were legislating visibility and control. I attempted to fight back through proper channels. I drafted a meticulously worded email to the official HOA board, citing the relevant sections of state law that governed homeowners associations and highlighting the unlawful nature of the demanded inspection. The email bounced back. Mailbox. Full. I called the listed number and reached a cheery automated voicemail that informed me the mailbox was full. Every official line of communication had been severed. The only response I received was another notice, this one hand-delivered by a sullen teenager on a bicycle who sped away as if my doorstep were contaminated. This notice was simpler. Failure to comply with a lawful order of the Security and Compliance Division will result in immediate detainment and forcible inspection. The word detainment was underlined. The game was escalating. The facade of civility was crumbling, revealing the iron fist beneath the velvet glove of neighborhood policy. I was being isolated, cut off from any legitimate recourse, boxed in by a set of rules that existed only to serve one person's thirst for control. The pressure was building, a steady, quiet hum of intimidation designed to make me crack, to let the wolves inside my door. And I knew, with the certainty of 2 decades spent in the field, that the knock was coming soon. What would you do if your peaceful street suddenly became a battlefield? Stand your ground or walk away? Tell me in the comments below. Driven by a professional paranoia that had saved my life more than once, I began a deep dive into the publicly available county records for the Laurel Ridge HOA. The financial filings, the meeting minutes, the property deeds. It was a dry, dusty mountain of bureaucratic paperwork. But buried in a digital archive of a 5-year-old meeting minute attached as a failed proposal, I found it. It was called the Community Sovereignty Bylaw. The language was dense and legalistic, but its intent was starkly clear. It proposed that in the event of a catastrophic breakdown of municipal authority or a prolonged failure of public law enforcement, the HOA board would be empowered to establish its own security force with full powers of detention, search, and seizure within community boundaries to uphold the covenants. It was a fantasy of secession, a play for ultimate power disguised as emergency preparedness. The proposal had been voted down, deemed too extreme even for Eleanor Vance's supporters at the time. But as I read the list of signatories in favor of the failed bylaw, a pattern emerged. They weren't just busybodies. They were all residents of the same cul-de-sac, Vance Vista, a secluded section of the neighborhood where Eleanor herself lived. And the chief of compliance who had signed my notice? His name was on the list. The notice on my door wasn't an isolated act of overzealous enforcement. It was a field test. They were trying to implement the failed bylaw anyway, using the pretext of my violations as their manufactured emergency. My clandestine dog door was their breakdown of municipal authority. This was no longer about a power-hungry HOA president. This was about a group of people attempting to establish a sovereign enclave, a tiny police state behind the white picket fences. The fake police weren't just for intimidation. They were the vanguard of a quiet, terrifying coup. My house wasn't just a target. It was the beachhead. If they could successfully detain me and forcibly enter my home under their own authority, they could do it to anyone. The first domino would fall, and the entire neighborhood would truly become Eleanor Vance's kingdom. The stakes had just been raised from a petty neighbor dispute to something far darker, and the quiet street outside my window now felt like the front line of a very different kind of war. The black sedan was now a permanent fixture. I decided to stop reacting and start acting. Using a non-bureau-issued laptop and an anonymous network, I began to dig deeper, beyond the property records and into the people. Eleanor Vance was a ghost. Before her reign as HOA president, there was almost no digital footprint, no social media, no professional history, nothing prior to 7 years ago. It was a level of anonymity that was either meticulously maintained or professionally scrubbed. The other names on the pro-bylaw list were similarly opaque. They were retirees, consultants, investors, vague titles that hinted at wealth but revealed no substance. Then I cross-referenced their property purchase dates. Every single one of them had bought their homes within a 6-month period. 7 years ago, all paid for in full with cash purchases from a single, obscure LLC registered in Delaware. It wasn't a neighborhood. It was a settlement, a planned community, but not for retirees seeking sunshine. This had the hallmarks of a safe house cluster, a place where individuals with something to hide could live under the radar, protected by a wall of bureaucracy and a queen bee who enforced absolute loyalty. My FBI training screamed one word: witness, protection. But it didn't fit. The U.S. Marshals don't set up entire neighborhoods. This was private. This was corporate. The pieces began to click into a horrifying new picture. The unauthorized subterranean modification citation. They were worried I was digging a tunnel. The non-standard electromagnetic emissions. They feared surveillance devices. My clandestine ingress point. They thought it was a covert entry for operatives. They weren't just power-hungry. They were terrified. They were hiding. And they believed I was a threat. The black sedan's occupants weren't just petty enforcers. They were the symptoms of a much larger corporate-backed security apparatus. Eleanor Vance wasn't just a dictator. She was their chief of security. Her HOA wasn't about property values. It was about operational security. The fake police were her private militia. And I, Ethan Cole, a genuine FBI agent, had inadvertently walked into the middle of their paranoid fantasy, confirming their worst fears. The knock on my door wasn't just about intimidation. It was a preemptive strike. The game had changed entirely. If you discovered your neighbors were hiding dangerous secrets, would you expose them or protect your own safety? Drop your thoughts below and tell me what you'd do. The pressure became overt, physical. I started my car one morning to a grinding noise that turned out to be a fistful of gravel poured into the brake drum. A rock, large enough to crack the glass, was thrown through my living room window one evening, accompanied by the sound of squealing tires. The message was clear: leave, or be removed. Reporting it to the local police was an exercise in frustration. The responding officer was polite but dismissive. "Neighborhood disputes," he said with a weary sigh, taking a report but offering little else. "The Laurel Ridge HOA is very proactive. They handle a lot of their own issues." He wouldn't meet my eyes. I realized then that Eleanor's influence extended beyond the subdivision's gates. She had either co-opted or intimidated the local authorities. I was in a bubble of her making. My only potential ally was the young father from down the street, Mark, who I'd seen struggling with a Vance Vista compliance notice on his toddler's treehouse. I approached him cautiously, offering my help in fighting the violation. For a moment, I saw a flicker of defiance in his eyes. Then he looked over my shoulder, his face went pale, and he muttered, "I've decided to just take it down. It's not worth the trouble," before hurriedly retreating into his garage. I turned to see one of the fake compliance officers leaning against the black sedan, watching us, a small, satisfied smile on his face. The isolation was complete. My work at the bureau began to suffer. The constant vigilance, the broken sleep, the sheer psychological weight of the siege made it impossible to focus on my remote briefings. I made a mistake, a small one, misrouting a piece of intelligence. My superior, Director Michael Shaw, called me. His tone was laced with professional concern that barely masked his irritation. "Is everything all right on your end? This isn't like you?" I couldn't tell him the truth. How could I? "I'm being harassed by my HOA" would sound like a joke, a pathetic excuse for incompetence. The two worlds I inhabited, the professional and the personal, were on a collision course, and my career was about to become a casualty of this absurd, terrifying conflict. I was being squeezed from all sides, my sanctuary transformed into a prison, my professional standing crumbling, and my every move monitored by a private army operating with impunity. The walls were closing in, and the countdown to a final, inevitable confrontation had begun. A plain manila envelope appeared in my mailbox, mixed in with the junk mail. No return address, no postage. It contained a single, grainy photograph, a long lens shot taken of me entering my own front door. Paperclipped to it was a photocopy of an internal FBI personnel memo, the kind that circulates to announce new assignments and clearances. My name was on it, my new remote liaison role highlighted in yellow. Someone had a source inside the bureau. This wasn't just neighborhood intimidation. This was an intelligence operation. They weren't just guessing I was a threat. They had confirmed it. The level of penetration required to get that document was staggering. It explained their extreme reaction, their absolute conviction that I was a threat. They weren't paranoid. They were informed. And they were terrified of what I might already know. That night, under the cover of darkness, I received a visitor. Not one of the fake cops, but Mr. Harris, the retired gnome collector. He moved like a shadow, slipping through my back gate after I'd disabled the overly bright motion light. His hands were shaking, his face ashen. "They know you know," he whispered, refusing to sit down, his eyes darting towards the windows. "The people in Vance Vista. They're not just hiding, they're waiting. They paid for protection, for a guarantee of silence. Eleanor isn't the boss, she's the manager. The real money, the real power, it's somewhere else." He told me a fragmented, terrified story. The residents of the cul-de-sac were witnesses, yes, but not from domestic trials. They were financiers, facilitators, arms dealers from conflicts the world had forgotten, people who had traded testimony for new identities and a gilded cage, funded by a private security conglomerate that specialized in asset relocation. The HOA was the cover. The compliance force was their private army. My presence, an actual federal agent, was a catastrophic systems failure. "They won't let you expose them," he said, his voice cracking. "They'll burn it all down before they let that happen. They're not going to arrest you. They're going to disappear you. And they'll make it look like you just left." He fled back into the night, leaving me with the chilling truth. I wasn't up against a crazy HOA. I was standing between a multinational private intelligence agency and its high-value clients. The fake police had real backing, real resources, and real permission to do whatever it took to maintain the integrity of their investment. The manila envelope on my table wasn't a warning. It was a death warrant. The final notice came at dawn. It wasn't slipped under the door. It was printed on a large, placard-style sign staked into my perfectly manicured lawn. "This property is condemned by order of the HOA Security Council. Forcible eviction and entry to be executed today at 18:00 hours. It was a declaration of war, a public spectacle designed to demonstrate their ultimate authority to the entire terrified neighborhood. They were no longer hiding their intentions. They were broadcasting them. My time was up. Adrenaline burned away the fatigue. This was no longer a defensive game. I was in my element now, a hardened location with a known threat and a clear deadline. I moved with a cold, focused efficiency I hadn't felt in years. I activated a protocol I'd hoped I'd never have to use on American soil. Using an encrypted, emergency-only satellite link, I sent a coded distress call to a specific desk at the Bureau, bypassing my entire chain of command. The message was simple: sovereign citizen extremist group, armed, impersonating LEOs, attempting unlawful seizure of federal agents' property. Imminent threat, request emergency intervention, evidence secured on site. It was a version of the truth, stripped of the incredible parts, designed to trigger the fastest possible response. Then I prepared the battlefield. I disabled the cloud backup on my home security system, ensuring all footage would be stored locally on a hidden, hardened drive. I gathered every piece of evidence, the notices, the photograph, the personnel, memo, and sealed them in a fireproof case, along with a signed affidavit detailing everything I knew. I placed it in a location they would never find. I didn't draw my service weapon. That would be their play, to provoke a shooting and justify their own violence. Instead, I set up multiple recording devices, ensuring audio and video coverage from every angle of my entryway and living room. I put on a jacket with a discreet body cam. I was going to make them famous. As the clock ticked down to 6:00 p.m., the street outside fell silent. Curtains were drawn, porch lights were turned off, the neighborhood was holding its breath. I stood in my living room, in the dark, watching the shadow of the placard on my lawn stretch longer and longer. The hum of the approaching vehicle wasn't the quiet sedan. It was the heavier diesel growl of a large SUV. They were coming not to intimidate, but to conquer. The final countdown had reached 0. The vehicle was a blacked-out Suburban, the kind used by government agencies and private military contractors worldwide. It didn't stop in the street. It mounted the curb and parked horizontally across my driveway, blocking any escape. The doors opened in unison. 4 figures emerged, not the discount rent-a-cops from before, but professionals. They moved with purpose, their tactical gear high quality, their postures alert and coordinated. These were the real players, the upgraded response team. Eleanor Vance emerged from the passenger seat, clutching a master key she likely had made for every house in the development. She pointed at my door. The lead operative, a broad-shouldered man with a cold, empty gaze, didn't knock. He raised a hydraulic door ram. This was it. I flipped on every light in the house simultaneously and swung the door open just as he was about to strike. The suddenness of it made him hesitate for a critical second. I stood in the doorway, my hands visible, and empty, my body cam live. Eleanor smiled, a vicious, triumphant thing. The time for warnings is over. Step aside. Eleanor Vance, I said, my voice projecting calm and carrying in the dead silence of the street. You are trespassing on private property. You and your security team have no lawful authority here. This is your only warning to leave. The lead operative recovered, his face twisting into a scowl. He dropped the ram and reached for my arm. You're coming with us for obstructing a lawful inspection. As his hand closed around my bicep, I didn't resist. I simply said, clearly and slowly for the recording, you are now forcibly detaining a federal agent without a warrant or probable cause. Identify yourself and your agency. He froze for a microsecond, the script broken. Eleanor shrieked, he's bluffing, he's just a nobody. Get him out of here. The operative's training warred with his orders. In that moment of hesitation, the sound we all heard cut through the tension, the distant rising wail of sirens. Not one or two, but a chorus of them, growing rapidly closer. The operative's head snapped up. Eleanor's triumph turned to confusion, then to panic. What did you do? She spat at me. I kept my eyes on the operative. I called for backup. The first black SUV with FBI shield emblems on the doors screeched to a halt at the end of the street, its spotlight flooding the scene. Then another and another. Armed agents in body armor poured out, taking positions behind their vehicles, weapons trained on the stunned compliance team. FBI! Everyone on the ground! Now! Hands where we can see them! The lead operative slowly released my arm, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He raised his hands. His team followed suit, kneeling on my manicured lawn. Eleanor Vance just stood there, her master key clattering to the pavement, her face a mask of utter shock as the kingdom she had built was dismantled in seconds. The real police had arrived. The fallout was swift and quiet, the way these things often are. The compliance team was arrested for impersonating law enforcement, unlawful detention, and a host of other charges. Eleanor Vance, faced with the mountain of evidence I provided, the recordings, the documents, the testimony of a now emboldened Mr. Harris, cut a deal. She revealed the structure of the private security firm that managed Vance Vista, a subsidiary of a sprawling multinational corporation. The investigation expanded far beyond our neighborhood, becoming a federal RICO case targeting the company for a slew of offenses. The residents of the cul-de-sac were quietly relocated again, their identities once more scrubbed from the world. The Laurel Ridge HOA was dissolved and replaced by a new board focused on pool maintenance and holiday decorations. its terrifying power broken. My superiors were understanding in that uniquely bureaucratic way. My methods were unorthodox, but the results were undeniable. I was quietly praised and strongly encouraged to take a vacation. I sold the house. The quiet, once so sought after, now felt heavy with memory. I sometimes drive past the old neighborhood. The lawns are still perfectly manicured, the house is still painted in approved shades. It looks peaceful, normal, but I see the small things now. The for sale sign that went up in Vance Vista and never came down. The way the new HOA president, a cheerful woman named Brenda, waves a little too eagerly at every car that passes. And the placard, the one they staked in my lawn, they never actually removed it. The post broke off at the base during the chaos of the arrest, and someone just pushed the leftover stump into the soil. If you know where to look, you can still see it. A small, weathered piece of wood barely peeking out from the grass, a silent splinter of the war that was fought and won behind the picket fence lines. A reminder that the thirst for control never truly disappears. It just waits for the right person to come along and turn a covenant into a weapon.